whether they're correct analysis, of course, I leave it to us as researchers and to you as researchers to figure that out. But in 2006 and 7, we had, in this province, 29,473 pregnancies. The newspaper report last week puts 2010 statistics at 12,971, and our Honourable Minister, Provincial Minister of Education, had a huge commentary about that. What's interesting about the 2006 and 7 statistics is that 59.4% of the pregnancies in the country were located in KwaZulu-Natal province. So what I've just put to you is simply a factual account of the tragedies that surround our children's lives, underwritten by systematic forms of social inequalities and racial inequalities. So when children teach us about sexuality, about love and gender, what they also teach us about is the social conditions under which they live. And they tell us more about the irresponsibility of the state in attending to their lives. Now, I'm going to say later that, of course, South Africa is doing quite a bit to correct these injustices, but of course, more needs to be done. Now, in all of this, the facts and the really frightening statistics through which children navigate their lives in this country is that the focus has been so much on sexual danger that we're missing expressions of love. So we've got one part of the coin, but we're missing the expressions of love, desires, attractions. So we need to understand that sexuality is not then just a domain of danger, but also a domain of exploration and excitements. Between 6 and 8, what do children do? Well, they engage, and I have to say that I have to speak about the value of ethnographies, because it allows the researcher to have deep understandings of what's going on and a more longitudinal understanding to sharpen our focus around children. And I don't think that rapid ethnographic assessment can actually provide that. So ethnographies are really useful because it allows you to see what children are doing in the context of a school, for example. So heterosexual play, kissing catches, you know that? Don't answer. Love letters, imagined boyfriends, teasing. So those are the kinds of the resources that young children deploy between the ages of 6 and 9, for example. And at age 16, sexuality might actually be have moved to the transition to sex. There is a strong preoccupation with relationships, both existing as well as imagined. And I want to argue here that not all sexualities are about danger, death, and disease. But as children show, and so here's the complexity, that when you talk about love, it's not some romantic ideal, but that love intertwines with power, and it intertwines with materiality. And we've all heard of the saying, love and money. How many of you are in relationships based on money? And yet we quick to point the angle to young women living in poverty, and particularly in the context of transactional sex, but I'll come to that later. So I think that it's important that we do not miss the ways in which young people, whether they're 6 or 16, give meanings to the ideals of love. But clearly, we need to ask questions about sexual violence. We need to ask questions about teenage pregnancy. We need to talk about young women's vulnerability to HIV and AIDS. We need to talk about those sugar daddies. But we need to do it in ways that account for the full expression of sexuality. And so part of my punchline tonight is that we need to think about South African childhoods in far more problematic ways than we currently have. And that we need to see sexuality as it is lived by children rather than as it is wished by us as adults. And so we need to develop more sophisticated understandings of children and drop the pretenses. Now, if we fail to see children, as I'm arguing, as gendered and sexual, how then can we promote gender equality as a necessary component of strategies for preventing violence and preventing HIV. If the people who matter to children, you and I, parents and teachers, if you and I hide sexuality, if we ignore it, we shame it, and we prevent it, we will continually have uninterrupted relations of domination and subordination, gender violence, and risk. Now, I'm not saying that that is alone the answer to the scourge, but I think it's part of the puzzle. Now, I've picked this up from UNICEF, and I think it's a really important message. If South Africa is to develop, we have to put children first. If you read the Mail and Guardian on Friday, the National Planning Commission asked the young people of South Africa to take the baton of 1976 and run along to the future. So in much of my work then, I'm disposed to reading children's meanings of sexualities and of schooling within the broader social context. And as I was planning again for this lecture, I came across an article that I had written in 2005 or 6, and I had quoted the Sunday Times October 27, 2002 report, where a 13-year-old boy in Kagiso had raped a different 9-year-old classmate each day in front of other pupils in a week-long orgy of violence. The boy, who stands a good 2 heads taller than the grade 1 classmates, allegedly forced 5 young boys to hold down the girls so that he could rape them. But I'm not going to read the whole thing, except to say that there is really something wrong if 10 years later, if you look at the newspapers in the last 2 weeks, and you see the heinous crimes of a 15-year-old gouging out the eyes of an 8-year-old and raping her. So 12 years later, these crimes are still so pervasive in our, and one is enough. That's my argument. And so how do we begin to understand this when we think that 13-year-olds and 8-year-olds should just be innocent and not worry about the buttercups and the sheep and not pay attention to what really matters in their lives? So the constructions of young masculinities is really important here. So when children come to school at 6 or 16, remember, they're not just coming to school as learners, and I think we fail to understand that, because much of the research I'm doing, we come to schools are places of academic spaces. We don't really deal with these matters, and yet they are actually being lived in the schools. So when they come to school, they indeed have embarked upon the lifelong project of learning gender and sexuality, but we don't want to believe it. We think that children are blank sheets and asexual. We think that they're unprotesting and passive recipients of sexual knowledge, and that we should be teaching them. So the overall assumption then is that children at age 6 do not possess the competence to make sense of their sexual behaviors. At 16, we tell them to abstain. But we forget about the B and the C. And in South Africa, I think we all know that B and C is be faithful and condomize. So the dominant ways of thinking of children as biological, as in terms of stages of development, mean that we don't want to admit that gender and sexuality is just a lifelong process. And we are ignoring it because of the ideas that we have that children and sex and sexuality are not, should not be properly integrated. Now, there's a huge literature about whether gender, the nature-nurture debate. And tonight, I'm not going into that because we have a sense of what that debate is, but it's not my task tonight to do that. But what I'm going to say is that my own work has been influenced by the understandings that gender is a social construction. So when I look at young children, when I try to understand what they say, it is about how power is negotiated, how power is exerted, and how power hierarchies are established. Quite simply then, constructions of masculinities or young masculinities is an assertion of power within relations of domination and subordination. Very young boys at age 6, they know that they jockey for power, and they know their place in gender relations already, repudiating and stigmatizing girls. So power is central to social relations of gender. And so, like others, I try to make a persuasive argument against those kinds of theories which prevent us from actually seeing the ways in which power is negotiated, is reproduced by even very young children. Now, in all of this, I really think that it's important that we don't create a bad man mentality in South Africa. My work is also so much about boys, young boys, and about sad boys. So it's certainly not about putting men down in the constructions of gender and trying to put men down in relation to the violence and the scourge. Clearly, there is a problem with the ideas that men hold in relation to sexual entitlement. Clearly, there is a problem with the ideas that some men hold in relation to violence. But not all South African men are bad, and not all boys are bad. In my own research, I found that there are many sad boys, boys who understand that their life chances are limited by historical and the persistent forms of social and economic inequality. So I want to just give you just one example of what one young boy aged about 15, 16 said to me. Well, I want to go to university, but I don't have the money. And so I think I'm just going to become a taxi driver. And so in much of what the young men are arguing about, it certainly speaks directly to issues around poverty, unemployment, and the state's responsibility to end it, including our own. Now, I don't want to create a situation here where you think that girls are simply victims. In much of my work, I have argued against the pitiful African construction of girls being pathetic victims of violence, of war, of conflict. That is not how South African girls actually live. Clearly, they are less powerful in relation to gender relations, but they are not less powerless. They are able to negotiate their gender, they are able to assert themselves, but when it comes to stark violence, to rape, of course, this obviates all prospects of choice. Now, so far, I've talked about the state's obligation and of course, the state is obliged, as we are, to remedy the situations that we currently have. In South Africa, the state is doing many, many things to change the context for children's lives. In schools, we are guided by policies that are in alignment with the Constitution. We have curricula that supports gender equality. We have curricula and life orientation that supports attention to sexuality and gender. We also have the Children's Act that I referred to, the Sexual Offences Act, and of course we have the Ministry of Women and Children. And so whilst South Africa is under siege in terms of gender and sexual violence, we have many voices that condemn such violence. So as many incidents of violence that we have many more that condemn it, and that is really a good thing. And we need more voices to condemn such violence. But despite all of this, we still have missing pieces in the puzzle, because we do have an inauspicious climate for the development of children's freedoms. So laws are important, but certainly they are not sufficient to end children's vulnerability. Now, this is the article that I was referring to earlier on when I talked about young masculinities, what happened 10 years ago, and what's happening 10 years later. So understanding the construction of young masculinities is really important. So boys are inducted very early on into the rituals of manhood. And men and boys are more likely, one goes to South African prisons, you will find a preponderance of men in jail. So men are the main agents of violence. They're more likely to be involved in rape, in crime, and we need to understand why. And so the masculinity theories allows us perhaps an angle to understand the ideas that men have that propels such conduct. However, we need to understand the social conditions under which men navigate, and why such material conditions have impact for the construction of masculinities. And this impacts not only on girls, but also on men and boys in relation to the social and health complications. I referred to this earlier around the pregnancy shock and the alarm at school. And here I just want to talk briefly about the constructions of femininities. And I want to repeat that I don't want to paint a picture of South African girls lying on the side of pitiful, pathetic victims and powerless, although we are led to believe that. We need to come to more sophisticated understandings of how girls themselves are agents. We need to understand, why is it that girls have such knowledge in my own research about bad men, and yet they still desire such men? So why is it then that girls make excuses for boys' bad behavior? Why do girls accept toxic masculinity? So it's not simply a case of violent boys against innocent girls, but it is a case of understanding the construction of femininities. What is it about the ideas that we have that allows us to accept and tolerate manly men, bad men, men who beat up women, and men who have multiple sexual partners, and men who spread AIDS? And I'm not saying men, it is men who spread AIDS, but women who have knowledge of that. And so we need to become much more sophisticated in disentangling our ideas about femininities. That when one talks about sugar daddies out there infecting young girls, we also need to ask, why are girls desiring older men with money? That it is, in my own work, and I'll come to that again, is that these young girls are actually desiring older men with money in order to get cash, clothes, and cell phones, and something that Leclerc Madlala had argued many years ago. So it is the idea that around what is love and what is acceptable to be a woman, as the ideas that men have about power and the pressures that they themselves bear in order to give power to themselves. So in terms of schooling, schools can be very unsafe places for young girls. We've seen that in the newspapers. This is from last week, more teachers guilty of lust. But I think we also need to be cautious about how we are constructing, and I know some of you here are male school teachers. I think we need to be cautious about how we are constructing male teachers as being simply guilty. Clearly, there are many school teachers that are involved in schools and see schools as actually a ripe and fertile site for sexual opportunity structures. But again, not all men are bad, and I want to repeat that. We need to be careful of creating that myth that men are bad, that men are not capable of change. Because if we believe that, then we believe there is no hope in the prospects of ending gender and sexual violence. So what I want to say then is that learning about gender and sexuality is not only about domination, it's not only about bad men, it is also about how femininities are being put into this, construction and the idea of what it means to be an appropriate girl, a good girl. Now, when I think about, in order to concretize what I'm saying, is that we must pay attention to the social context. So imagine a GPS system, you know, it has specific coordinates. So when you put down specific coordinates, there are people located in specific coordinates. And in understanding place and space, understanding culture, because all of that impacts in how people give meaning to gender, to how people give meaning to love and express their agency. Now, here I want to talk to the three projects that I have been working, some of them completed, others, the last one still in progress, the one on 16 turning 17. And I want to illustrate some of the main arguments that I've been making thus far. In one of my earliest projects, I looked at children, and remember, these are children in both black and white schooling contexts, and I think that is important because race and class are so intimately tied in South Africa. I kept asking myself during the research process, very early on, how is it that girls become gendered? How is it that boys become gendered? And can the very early years of schooling become sites for engineering gender equality? Education always involves some kind of reflection, some kind of interrogation and thinking and rethinking. So I think it is the appropriate place for us to rethink the ideas that we have that children are asexual. So how then do young children express sexuality at 6 and 7? One, I call it momentary discourses, because you see it and then you don't. So you see kissing catches and then you don't. You see teasing and then you don't. You see children talk about who loves who and then you don't. And yet it is so visible, and all of this is glossed over because teachers think that children are innocent. What's important in my work around 6 to 9 is that even as they are giving meaning to sexuality, they are giving meaning to gender, and there is deep manifestations already about male power. And I think that is really of concern. What I want to highlight just some of the issues around the constructions of masculinity. And the one is that even boys at 6 and 7 demonstrate toxic forms of masculinity and are involved in violent gender relations. And that was really a very sad and striking moment for me many, many years ago, when very young boys use their power, assert their power over girls. But this doesn't mean then, and other softer targets, and in one instant they named it imvu, which is like a sheep kind of masculinity, a lower order masculinity. But I want to draw your attention to this fact, that it is not only boys who do violence. Young girls are also inducting themselves into the rituals of violence. So a warrior type of femininity. And so I can talk much here about violence and about agency, but this is not the place. What I do want to say, that in the absence of all resources, that violence becomes a resource. It becomes a tool in the survival of the fittest. So even girls at age 7 and 8 are using violence in order to assert their power and to get a slice of bread. So that then was my earlier project. And just quickly to say that in some contexts, a rugga-bugga masculinity has been formed. And so how young boys give meaning to their masculinities is not only through violence, but also through the cricket bats that they bring to school. So the one that has the best cricket bat also has access to power, and that is economic power. The boy who knows more about rugby players validates his masculinity. And the boy who knows more about science and maths also validates his masculinity. And so even in the very early years of schooling, laughter and jokes are used to subordinate girls, but they're also used to construct a homophobia. So boys at 6, they know about gender benders. So I want to then move on to the 7 to 8-year-olds and the gender, sexuality, and HIV and AIDS. And so once I'd completed this project, I moved on to 7 and 8-year-olds because I found an omission in my work in relation to HIV and AIDS. And this issue continually remains under-recognized in the literature, that not much attention is being given to sexuality and children who are 7 and 8. And so advocates for children's rights may feel threatened and troubled if, as I have argued, that children at 7 and 8 have sexual rights. South Africa is a signatory to the Convention of the Rights of the Child. South Africa's Constitution and South Africa's Children's Act gives rights to children of all ages and does not discriminate. But when you say that children at age 7 have sexual rights, it does present some kind of controversy. So some of the main findings here, that children actually do have knowledge of AIDS. They know that AIDS is a disease, yes. They also know that AIDS is related to sex. Now, in my other work, I interviewed teachers, and teachers deliberately removed issues and matters around sex to children because they said it's not relevant to them. And yet, what is actually happening in terms of what children know is that they associate AIDS with sex. AIDS is also very racialized, and so AIDS becomes the new vector in the spread of racism. And so when children in a township context give meaning to HIV and AIDS, they also talk about the political economy. They talk about how wealth and health are so unevenly distributed. And so part of my arguments is that the AIDS pandemic is certainly, in the townships, for example, is due to the township's lamentable positioning in relation to its economic and positioning, as well as the sexual economies. Children already associate AIDS with rape. So when you ask children, what is AIDS? One of the first responses was AIDS is rape. So AIDS and rape are intimately connected. So that even at age 7, young girls are understanding their place in the sexual hierarchies in the country. And so one of my major arguments is that we need to attend to the development of skills and attitudes, and we need to be able to integrate behavior that makes young people, boys and girls, understand their relations and the ways in which they give meaning to gender, to develop safer pathways. So I ask, of the 7-year-olds that I've interviewed, a statistic, the AIDS statistics at age 15 or 16, and what have we done to interrupt and to prevent that from happening? And finally, in my 16 Turning 17 project, I've looked at a couple of issues, and I've talked about the central preoccupation that young people talk to me about relationships. So whether they're white or black, they talked about boyfriends, girlfriends, they talked about risks, they talked about things that made them happy. Now, these are girls and boys in schools. They talked about breakups, they talked about cheating, and they talked about the emotional effects that such relationships had upon them. And these are really significant to attend to, and they also expressed interest in and imagined boyfriends and girlfriends. I call it suburban loves for those girls located in more middle-class environments and boys. And they talked about boyfriends that they missed. They talked about the regulations and the restrictions in relation to how boys perhaps regulated girls' activities and freedoms. And they took much delight in talking to me about their hurt and their pains and their sighs and their excitements. And I was like, aunt, agony aunt. So what do you think I should do? My boyfriend has done this, or my girlfriend has done this. Another area of my work is that girls want money, boys want virgins. In a township context, some of the girls aspired towards men with money, and I've talked about that earlier. What boys wanted were virgins. So boys in these interviews in the township constructed township girls as the drama queens. They constructed township girls as being not virgins. And so what they did was to idealize and to desire rural girls. And so I think that's really important stuff happening here, because if one looks at the literature, you find that our KwaZulu-Natal rural contexts are regarded as hot spots in the context of the HIV and AIDS pandemic, affecting young women in particular. So when these boys were talking to me about the idealization and their love interest being geared towards African girls in rural contexts, I asked, to what extent is this idealization part of the pathology that we have in relation to the townships and the hotspots, and the rural areas and the hotspots in the AIDS pandemic? So love then, what these children are telling me, is that love is produced under particular social circumstances. It matters where you are in South Africa as a child, and it matters who you are, and points to our histories and our persistent social and economic inequalities. Another area that I want to talk about here is the issue around violent femininities. Now, I referred to earlier that at age 7, young girls are indeed constructing their femininities according to violence. But we have a view, and that view has been represented in the Gender Equity Task Team report, the only report in South Africa dealing with gender in education in 1997, and of course the researcher presenting the argument that single-sex girls' schools are the best thing for girls' empowerment. But what do I find in this research? In the research with young girls in a single-sex former white school, there is a great deal of conflict and sometimes even erupting into physical violence. And if we think that we're putting girls into single-sex schools to avoid boys and to avoid the heterosexual connection, I think we need to rethink, because the male is still in the head. And so we need to rethink our views about whether single